Okay, let's see. I think that the biggest objection, and this one's got 141 likes, and unfortunately there's like 3 or 4 things bundled up here, but why don't we just start with the top one? Papal authority. And so I think what I'd like you to do in true Thomas Aquinas style is maybe to sort of sum up problems people tend to have with the papacy as best as you can. Obviously, there's multiple different problems, but one problem, and then help us by responding to it.
Okay, so I guess people can have a number of different possible objections here. One objection is the idea that there should be a pope at all. And then even if you don't have a problem with that, you might have a problem with the specific type of authority that the Pope has, and there's more than one type. Essentially, he has both governing authority and teaching authority. And then within the teaching authority category, the common objection that people will have is, what level of teaching authority does he have? Can he actually speak to an issue infallibly, and what are the limits of that, and how often does it happen, and so forth. So with regard to the idea of should there be a pope at all, well, basically the pope is the leader of the church in Jesus's absence, and it's most people do not have a problem with the idea of there being a church leader, even a single church leader, even in groups that have a very different way of approaching church governance. Like, let's say Baptists, for example. Well, in a typical Baptist parish or church, you're going to have a pastor or a senior pastor who's the leader of that church. And within a conference of Baptist churches, like let's say the Southern Baptist Conference, there's going to be a president of the Southern Baptist Conference. And this is something that falls straight out of human nature. Humans are social creatures. We are more like wolves than tigers, in that we naturally form groups, and groups need organization, and organizations need organizers, which means organizations need leaders. And in order to avoid confusion, there ultimately needs to be a single leader. There have been experiments with co-equal leaders in Rome a couple of times during the Republic. They tried to experiment with having a 3 co-equal leaders. This was known as the triumvirate, the 3 men. And both times it fell apart into civil war quite quickly, like within a generation, because there were disagreements among the 3 men. And that led to the rule by one person, or what was known as the monarchy, in Rome, because of their history, because they had originally had kings and then kicked them out and proudly became a republic. They couldn't call their monarchs kings. So they called them emperors instead. But this is just something that comes straight out of human nature. You look around the world at all the different nations. There's, 150 nations in the world, depending on how you count them. They all have a single head. Now that head may have different rules about how you get into office, or how long you stay in office, or what kind of power you have while you're in office, but there's always a single leader. So this is just something that God has built into human nature. And if that's the case for the human race in general, you would expect that principle to apply in God's church. So Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell are not going to prevail against it, so it's never going to pass out of existence. And in what context does he do that? It's naming Peter as the rock on which he's going to build his church. And we could debate the exegesis of that passage, but even many Protestant scholars will acknowledge, Jesus is saying, Peter, you're the leader of this group. And then it's a question of, well, what implications does it have from there? And so if Jesus deemed that his church needed a leader in its first generation, when it was just a few dozen and then later a few hundred or a few thousand people, how much more is it going to need a leader when it's billions of people? because, the Catholic Church today has more than a billion members. There's more than 2 billion Christians in the world today. If the church needed a single leader, even as a small group, it's certainly going to need one as a large group. And so it's natural for there to be a pope, and we see this reflected in various passages in Scripture. If people would like a more detailed look at some of the biblical exegesis, the biblical reasons for that, they could check out a paper that's at my website, jimmyakin.com. It's called Why Be Catholic? An Exercise for Evangelicals. And so they can check out at jimmyakin.com, Why Be Catholic? An Exercise for Evangelicals. And it'll cover some of the exegetical reasons why there would be a pope. Now, if we go ahead
real quick, because I think this might be where you're going. Jacob Hobby says, as someone who's flirted with Catholicism before, my biggest hang-up is I really can't find a full proof for papal infallibility. If that's proven, then everything else is dominoes at that point. I'd have to become Catholic.
Yeah, I was definitely going to go here. The teaching authority is one that particularly a lot of people have difficulty with. So we've kind of established there should be a pope. He would need some kind of authority, at least governing authority. So then, what kind of teaching authority would he have? Well, Jesus didn't just appoint the apostles to be managers. He didn't just give them governing authority. He gave them teaching authority. And we would expect this also to be part of, it's a fundamental part of Christ's church, teaching authority, and you would expect that to be manifest through its leadership, including through its head leader, the Pope. So the question then becomes, how extensive is this? And there's not a single text in Scripture that proves by itself papal infallibility. In order to appreciate that, there are texts that resonate with it. I think one of the most interesting texts is found in John 11, where you have the Jewish high priest, who's the Old Testament equivalent of the Pope. And in John 11, after the resurrection of Lazarus, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, is having a meeting because they're very concerned. Jesus has raised Lazarus, and they say, look, if Jesus is doing all these signs, if we let him go on like this, everyone's going to believe in him, and it's going to start a war, because people think of him as this military messiah. It's going to start a war. The Romans are going to come in and destroy our city, meaning Jerusalem, and they're going to destroy our holy place, meaning the temple. And of course, that's exactly what happened, although not because Jesus started a war, because other Jews did. Mm-hmm. Well, the high priest at that point, as they're debating this, says, you guys don't know anything at all. Don't you realize it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish? And so he wants to kill Jesus. But what he said is, it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish. And John, the inspired author of the gospel, steps in with a comment at that point and says, he did not say this on his own, but because he was high priest that year, he prophesied about Jesus' death. That Jesus' death is indeed what saves us, and it's better that this happen for our sake than that it not happen. And so John regards this as a divinely inspired prophecy. Even though the high priest was not a prophet in the full normal sense of the term, he didn't regularly issue oracles from the Lord. Nevertheless, we see that there was a kind of prophetic guidance, a prophetic charism that was associated with the office of high priest, that in limited circumstances allowed him to speak things that were true on behalf of God. And we also see that in the Old Testament. That's the essence of what the Urim and Thummim were, that the high priest would use to inquire of the Lord. So there's always been a kind of teaching charism that involves guidance from the Lord associated with the office of high priest. And if you're able to speak for the Lord, whether it's through Urim and Thummim, whether it's through prophecy, or whether it's through some other mechanism, if God's talking, God's right. And that means what he says is infallible. It's guaranteed to be true. And if we see some kind of infallibility charism, even if it's manifested differently, but if we see some kind of infallibility charism associated with the Old Testament equivalent of the Pope, then we would expect to see the same kind of thing associated with the New Testament Pope. And this is something that I realized more than 30 years ago now when I was in the process of becoming Catholic. It's an argument that I've popularized in apologetic circles. It has to be done with care. It's not an identical charism, but it does show that it's reasonable for there to be such a charism. And then you approach the question of, well, what else can we say about would the Pope, in limited circumstances, because that's all the Church is claiming, in limited circumstances be infallible? Well, if he wasn't, and this was a theological reason that Christian authors explored down the centuries, if he wasn't infallible in at least some circumstances, then it would be possible for the Pope to definitively bind the consciences of the faithful to believe something false. And that seems contrary to the will of God, that he would allow the leader of his earthly people to bind his faithful to believe something that's false. And so the Church reasoned from that and from various traditions, which are outside the Bible but are connected with the role of the Pope. It reasoned that at least in some limited circumstances, God must protect the Pope from teaching error to the faithful. And then at the First Vatican Council in 1870, they defined exactly what those conditions were, and to allow people to distinguish between infallible and non-infallible statements. Infallible statements by the Pope are by far the minority. The great majority of things the Pope says are not taught under the charism of infallibility, but occasionally, when the Pope uses the fullness of his teaching authority, God does provide a guarantee that what he says is true. And if people would like to read more about that, I would recommend a book I wrote on the subject called Teaching with Authority. It covers all aspects of the Church's magisterium or teaching authority, not just papal infallibility, but the whole range of ways the Church teaches and the different authority levels that those teachings have.
That's great. One final kind of follow-up on this issue of the papacy, and going along what you said there, like it would seem against God's will that his representative on earth should bind the Church to error. But what do you say to those who say, well, it also seems contrary to God's will that the representative of Christ on earth should believe false things, teach false things not infallibly, and cause scandal? In the history of the Church, we've had scandalous and continue to, all popes are sinners. How do you kind of respond to that issue of sinful popes?
It's certainly contrary to God's will that any person sin or believe something false, whether that person is the Pope or not. But we know that God allows those things, and God allows those things in the case of popes too. The question is not, does God always protect a pope from believing or teaching something that's wrong or sinning, but are there circumstances in which we can be sure that he is protecting the pope in these ways? And not just the pope, but the bishops of the Church as a whole, when they act as a whole, have the same charism of infallibility. So it is something that's happened, and the claim of the Church is not that it should always, that the Pope is always going to be right, or that he's always going to be morally pure in what he does, but that there are at least limited circumstances in which God will protect the faithful from error by protecting the Pope from teaching error.
If you like that clip, be sure to like and subscribe. Cheers.